Hey there, welcome back. So, I meant to do this video on Wednesday, which was my and John Lennon's birthday, October 9th. However, I decided not to because I felt like being lazy. Yeah, it was my birthday after all, so, if you can't be lazy on your birthday, when can you not be? I mean, especially as you get to my age, 45. You find that the opportunities to be lazy and do nothing kind of fade. And so on those rare occasions when you have a chance to take some time off and reflect and think about stuff or just to be lazy, you take them. So, today, October 13th, a full however many days after my birthday and John Lennon's birthday, I'm going to do a quick little run through of some of the best Beatles books that I've ever read that I happen to have in front of me. I'm a huge Beatles fan. Primarily because in early age, I would say maybe 10, 12, something like that, somewhere in there, I was looking through a Guinness Book of World Records and I saw John Lennon listed. And of course, by this point, he had been dead probably 10 or 11 years. But they had like his birthday and his death day. And I saw that his birthday was October 9th, 1940. And my birthday is October 9th, 1979. So you can't believe how much that went to my head as a preteen, teenager. Uh, it definitely played a part in my becoming a huge Beatles fan, especially a fan of John. And there are many reasons why, as I've gotten older, I don't necessarily hero worship John anymore. I think his life was certainly more complicated than the official narrative of Saint John, the peaceful, loving warrior of peace and all that. I think, really, I think the case could be made, of course, that in some ways he wasn't the greatest human being in the world, and none of us are. That's for certain, myself included. But for all the trauma that he went to through and some of the trauma that he caused with some people around him, all in all, I think the world is a better place for him having lived and having advocated for peace during his lifetime. The extent to which that was performance art on his part with his wife Yoko is up for debate. I think a lot of it was performance art, to be honest. Like the bag in for peace and the bed in for peace, and things like that. Like he knew very smartly that the world was going to be paying attention to him and Yoko on their honeymoon anyway. So why not use it to advance a cause that he believed in? So, you know. So I'm going to start today with two books that he actually wrote. One during his lifetime, one published posthumously. The posthumous one is Skywriting by Word of Mouth, and the one published during his lifetime is In His Own Right. And I found a copy of this one at the library not too long after I got into the Beatles. Excuse me. And to be honest, I haven't reread it since I was probably a teen. Excuse me. Since I was a teenager. However, I remember really liking it a lot at the time. And, the same thing with In His Own Right when I got around to it. The thing about John Lennon as a literary person is that he is very much influenced by Lewis Carroll. And I didn't read Alice Through the Looking Glass or Alice in Wonderland until probably last year, actually. So I can't really speak with authoritativeness about the extent to which Lewis Carroll influenced John Lennon and his literary style, especially his lyrics like I Am the Walrus, which, for my money, is probably, if not the best John song from the Beatles. Musically, lyrically, it's up there. I hate Come Together. Please, if you like the Beatles and you love the song Come Together, don't come at me because in the comments, but I I just hate that song. I do. I don't know what it is. The wordplay in that is kind of like, haha, clever, and it's like, it's not really that good. The music is kind of eh. It's always struck me as like the worst possible way to kick off an otherwise classic album in Abbey Road. But a lot of people, based on the times that I've said on my social media that I hate Come Together, a lot of people seem to disagree. But that's neither here nor there. All this is to say that, in a way, I feel like, especially this book, and I reread it, I want to say last year, a couple years ago. Uh, I don't know that it would have been published if it hadn't been for the fact that John Lennon was famous Beatle John Lennon, because this came out in 1964, right at the height of Beatlemania. And I think it's fair to say that it's kind of like celebrity vanity project circa 1964. However, it is still pretty good, I think. I enjoyed it. I remember liking Skyrise by Word of Mouth, which I may revisit just for the heck of it this year before the end of the year to bump up my Goodreads reading count for the year. But those are the John Lennon books that are his own work, in his own right, if you will. Next up, I have The Lennon Companion. This is a collection of articles, essays, mostly articles written during John's lifetime when he was in the public eye, from about 1962, 1963 up until his death. And then there's stuff, remembrances and so on. And I think it's always good to go back and read stuff that was published during a famous person's lifetime before the mythologizing kicks in. Because there are some pieces in here, from what I remember, where the person talking about John or the person writing about John doesn't really seem to care for him or the Beatles, and that's fine. You can go through life not liking the Beatles. I don't know why you would want to go through life not liking the Beatles, but, to each their own. It's a free country. But I really enjoyed this book when I read it. I was kind of on the fence about keeping it, to be honest, because, I bought it for like $10 at a store, and, every now and then you go people who collect books know this feeling where, like, you go through the books that you have and you start to wonder, like, do I really need this anymore, or did I even really like this first time around? It just depends. But yeah, I decided to keep it. And like I said, the Beatles were in the public eye from 1963, really, even though their recording career did kicked off a year prior, 1962. But they were really in the public eye from 1963 to 1970. And during that time, a lot was written about them. And especially after John's death and the possibility of a real-time reunion went away with that, there were a lot more books written about the Beatles, about John Lennon. And one of the first, and in my mind, one of the best, even though it certainly has its critics, is Shout, The Beatles in Their Generation by Philip Norman. I read this one early in my Beatles fandom. I think a librarian at my local library recommended it to me whenever I told her I was interested in the Beatles. I could be remembering it wrong. But Shout is arguably the first draft of history when it comes to the Beatles, especially right after John's death. And it goes into really good detail about their early years. Like, I had no idea when I first got into the Beatles, this nice, approachable, family-friendly quartet that they had played at strip clubs in Hamburg, Germany, as their apprenticeship, as it were. That's one of the details you get in this book. You get details about Brian Epstein and his conflicted relationship with the Beatles, relationship with John Lennon in particular. And it's just, better books have been written since Shout came out. And I think there are worthwhile criticisms of the book to be made. I think one of the big things is that Paul McCartney doesn't really care for how he's portrayed in the book, which, you know, saying this as someone who got into the Beatles primarily because I was, had that connection with John Lennon through having the same birthday, I can see where painting Paul as the villain of the piece is something that a lot of people do. I certainly was guilty of that for a while. I think the more obvious cause of the Beatles breakup, if you will, in quotation marks, is usually ascribed to Yoko Ono. But let's be real here for a minute. She did not break up the Beatles. Time broke up the Beatles. Money and anger over, you know, composition credits and uh, time and just that all togetherness that they were forced to endure because there were only four of them stuck together in hotel rooms going across the world making music for everyone while they were unable to live a normal life because they were the Beatles. That broke up the Beatles. Yoko is not exactly innocent in that, I think, but she was not the primary engine of the Beatles break. In fact, no. Let me walk back what I just said. She was she was complicit in John giving John a further reasons to leave the Beatles, and he technically left the Beatles first before Paul broke him up. But she was not the cause of it, and a lot of the anger directed her way is just plain good old fashioned racism, really, because she's a Japanese woman, married to at the time she was married to a white man in the 1960s, and a lot of people across the world could not handle that. So yeah, but overall, I think this book still holds up. I would say this is the best starting place for the Beatles lore, and then I would read maybe just any other book that you get your hands on about the Beatles that is reputable or even disreputable, because it helps to learn from as many sources as you can about the Beatles or about anything really. But yes, the Beatles Shout, I highly recommend, with the caveat that some of it is outdated, some of it is probably not relevant anymore, but what is? I'm going to skip one and move on to, or I'll bring it up later. Excuse me. This is Can't Buy Me Love by Jonathan Gould, The Beatles, Britain and America. Excuse me. This one is very good. I would say the only thing about it is on my reread recently, I was kind of, it goes into like really detailed descriptions of the songs on each Beatles album, which there is another book coming up here that does that as well. But in this one, it kind of distracts from the overall narrative, I think. But that being said, this book, I would say after you read Shout, read this one. And then later on, you can read the last book that I'm going to talk about. Or you can read Dreaming the Beatles by Rob Sheffield, which is also a great book about the Beatles that kind of ties into the last one. So I might talk about that one a little bit more before I do uh, the last book. But anyway, Can't Buy Me Love, Jonathan Gould, is a very good, very detailed history of the Beatles in their time from the roughly 1940s when they were all born to the breakup of the Beatles in 1970, and it kind of stops there, logically enough. And I think part of the reason why the Beatles endure is because they never got back together. Not really. I mean, the reunion for the Beatles anthology, and then like the most recent reunion for what was that song? It's one of those things I'll remember the name of it as soon as I get done with the video, and I'm not going to go back and edit it and add it in, and But anyway, you know the one I'm talking about. That was released, I think, last year about this time. But they never really reunited. They never really, in the eyes of the public, healed the wound that they left at the end of the 1960s. And they never did reunion tours and like sucked, you know? Like there are bands that reunited and they did a tour or they did an album and it's like, why? Why did you do that? You had a legacy. You could have retired off of that and or you could have lived off that for years. But the Beatles never really had the chance to do that because, of course, unfortunately, Lennon died in 1980. But all in all, this is a good, like I said, this is a good follow up to Shout. This is a good sort of more in depth history of the Beatles. And again, the thing that it didn't really work for me on the reread was the in-depth sort of explanation or examination of each track on each Beatles album, because certainly by the time we got to the White Album I was like, that's like 30 something songs, dude. Are you seriously going to spend a paragraph and a half on Revolution number 9? He did, or at least he did a paragraph, but there you go. Now, for a book about the Beatles song by song, that's actually, if you're looking for that, really fun, Revolution the Head by Ian McDonald. I want to get that right. Ian McDonald. This one I did not read. I did check out a copy of it back, I want to say 1996, from the library at Columbia, or no, 1997 in Columbia, South Carolina, while I was going to the University of South Carolina. Promptly flunked out of the school because reasons. I wasn't mature enough at the time. But anyway, we're not going to get into that. We're not going to go back in time and talk about why I flunked out of college first time around. Instead, we're going to talk about Revolution in the Head, which is a very good song by song breakdown of the Beatles era. And what McDonald does very well, besides going in terms of when the songs were recorded, not necessarily in the order in which they appeared on albums, is that he can surprise you with his opinions about songs. And sometimes you agree with him, but in a lot of ways, like whenever I read like a Roger Ebert review of a movie that I love and he hates it, or when I read a review of a movie that I hate and Roger Ebert loves it, it's that fun sort of like agree to disagree kind of thing. Because I think in this book, I want to say he really loves Come Together, which is that is not my favorite Beatles song by any stretch of it. That is, of the hits, that is my least favorite Beatles song. I'm going to quit going on about that because I don't want to get a bunch of comments about that from people who love the song. Though if you do love the song, by all means, comment about it. Great. We can agree to disagree, or we can fight about it, whichever you prefer. But this is a really fun, detailed look at the book, the songs, excuse me. The book is a really detailed, fun look at the songs, and a lot of it is really about his opinions about each song. And, if you agree, great. If you disagree, even better in a way. I think he's a lot more lenient on some songs than others that I personally like or prefer. And then there are times where I'm like, really? You like that one? There is, I would say, a bias early on towards Lennon as the main songwriter in the band, and then he kind of McDonald shifts to McCartney later on. And Paul, obviously, if you know the history of the band, Paul kept the group going after Brian Epstein's death in 1967 because that was really the moment when the Beatles started to break up. If you know the history of the Beatles, like I know the history of the Beatles, you'll say, yeah, the group, the first crack in the armor was the death of Brian Epstein in 1967. That started the entire process of the Beatles eventually breaking up, at least 3 years later, 3 or 4 years later. So before I talk about the final book that I have physically in front of me, I also want to do a quick shout out to Rob Sheffield's book, Dreaming the Beatles, which really ties into the last book in that both are kind of unconventional histories of the group. And what I mean is they go chronologically. Well, certainly the Dreaming the Beatles does go chronologically, but it's also broken up into like appreciations, list, things like this of like Beatles songs, Beatles characters, sort of highlighting certain aspects of the Beatles history. And Sheffield is really one of the best writers about music and pop culture currently going. And if you find a copy of Dreaming the Beatles, you should definitely pick it up. You should also pick up 150 Glimpses of the Beatles by Craig Brown. This one is a lot of fun because, unlike Shout, it goes through the history of the Beatles, but it does it in an interesting way where it's literally 150 glimpses. Like, here, let me show you. Let me find an example page of short, like take 57, take 58. There's just different short, usually short essays about different aspects of the Beatles and different aspects of pop culture that affected them, that they affected. Uh, and really, the Beatles are inescapable in pop culture. I'm sorry. There's just no way that you can go through life without being aware of them. And that might be why some people dislike the Beatles or say they dislike the Beatles, which, fair's fair. But uh, one of the appeals of the book is that it goes in different tangents and different directions than you would think. And personally, like I said, I am a huge Beatles fan. I love everything about them except Come Together. That song is garbage. And again, I'm courting controversy by mentioning it so many times as the song that I hate. But you know what? So, uh, yeah, this is probably like I would say read Shout first, read Can't Buy Me Love first, and then if you're really into the Beatles, this one works a lot better if you're like really into the Beatles already or are familiar with their story, but it's a lot of fun. It really is. It might be, I wouldn't say it's the best book about the Beatles I've ever read, but it's the most fun. So, anyway, thank you for indulging me in my John Lennon slash Beatles fan service video. And I apologize for the lateness of it, but you know what? That's the way it goes. And I will try and come up with something for next Saturday or Sunday, depending on what I feel like. And until then, keep reading.